Gary Ridgway murdered at least 49 women and evaded investigators for nearly 2 decades. After his arrest in 2001, he sat across from detectives and told them something they were not prepared to hear. He had been returning to his victims' bodies, not to destroy evidence, not out of panic. He returned because, in his own words, he wanted to feel close to them again. The instinct to return to the scene of a crime is so consistent across violent offenders that behavioral analysts have cataloged it, studied it, and built investigative strategies around it. It has closed cold cases. It has placed suspects at scenes years after the fact. And it has produced some of the most chilling confessions in the history of American law enforcement. This is the documented psychology behind one of the most self-destructive patterns in criminal behavior, and how, case by case, it became the thing that brought them down. The serious study of post-offense behavior began within the FBI's Behavioral Science Unit at Quantico, Virginia, in the late 1970s. Agents Robert Ressler and John Douglas conducted structured interviews with dozens of convicted serial killers and violent offenders, interviews that formed the foundation of what we now call criminal profiling. Among their most consistent findings was this: a significant number of violent offenders maintained an active relationship with their crimes long after the act itself. They returned, physically, psychologically, or both. The behavior is not uniform. Some offenders return to the location of the crime, the house, the road, the trail, the riverbank. Others return to the victim through collected items, a piece of clothing, a photograph, an object that functions as a retrieval mechanism for memory. And others, in what researchers call investigative insertion, re-enter the orbit of the case itself, following news coverage obsessively, attending public vigils, or making direct contact with the detectives hunting them. None of these behaviors are random. Each serves a function, and understanding that function changed how law enforcement approaches the aftermath of violent crime. To see how, consider 4 men, 4 cases, 4 different expressions of the same compulsion, and 4 investigations that might have remained unsolved had these men only stayed away. In the summer of 1982, King County, Washington, authorities began recovering bodies near the Green River south of Seattle. The victims were young women, many of them runaways or women who worked in street prostitution, a population that investigators have since acknowledged did not receive the investigative resources these cases demanded. A task force was assembled. Tips poured in. The murders continued. Gary Leon Ridgway was a house painter who lived in the area. He was interviewed by detectives in 1982. The following year, he was interviewed again after a surviving victim identified him as a client. He passed a polygraph examination. He was cleared, and investigation continued elsewhere. The Green River killings went on for years. Meanwhile, in Wichita, Kansas, a different set of crimes was unfolding, crimes that were not quiet. In January 1974, a family of 4 was found strangled in their home on Edgemore Street. The killer had bound them, tortured them, and left behind evidence of a deliberate and carefully considered attack. Over the following 17 years, 9 more people would die in similar circumstances across the Wichita area. The killer wrote letters. He sent them to newspapers, to television stations, to police. He gave himself a name, BTK, for bind, torture, kill. He described his crimes in detail, critiqued the coverage of his cases, and expressed frustration when he felt law enforcement was not taking him seriously. He was organized, methodical, and entirely unidentified for 3 decades. 2 cases, 2 killers operating in different states, neither caught at the scene. Neither caught by witness testimony or physical evidence left in the immediate aftermath of a crime. Both, ultimately, caught by what they could not stop doing long after the crimes were over. The break in the Green River case came incrementally. In 1987, King County investigators brought Ridgway in again and collected a saliva sample and additional physical evidence. Technology at the time could not use it. The samples were preserved in evidence storage and largely set aside as the case continued without resolution. In 2001, the King County Sheriff's Office resubmitted those 1987 samples for newly available DNA testing. The results returned a match to biological material recovered from 3 Green River victims. Gary Ridgway was arrested on October 30, 2001, at the Kenworth truck plant where he had worked for years. What followed was one of the most operationally significant debriefings in recent FBI history. King County prosecutors, working with federal investigators, offered Ridgway an agreement. In exchange for providing the location of victims whose remains had never been found, he would be removed from consideration for the death penalty. He accepted. For months, Ridgway traveled with detectives through forests, along river corridors, and across rural Washington state, pointing out locations that most of his victims' families had spent years hoping to find. He knew these places in detail. He knew them because he had been back to many of them, repeatedly, over years. In his documented debriefing statements, Ridgway described these return visits in terms of dominance. He told investigators that returning to his victims gave him a sense of continued control, that the location of a body was, in his psychology, still a place that belonged to him. Some sites showed evidence consistent with repeated visits, disturbed ground, cleared debris. Investigators noted that in at least several locations, Ridgway's returns had, in a grim irony, better preserved the site than the environment alone would have. The Green River investigation ultimately recovered remains across a wide geographic corridor of western Washington. The final confirmed death toll, 49 victims. In Wichita, the break in the BTK case came from a different kind of return and from a deliberate investigative deception. Dennis Rader had gone silent after 1991. 13 years passed without communication. Then in 2004, local news coverage of the BTK case increased, a book was published, anniversary coverage aired, and Rader resumed contact. He sent packages. He sent photographs of himself at crime scenes taken years earlier. He sent letters referencing details only the killer could know. And then in early 2005, he wrote to investigators with a question. He asked whether a computer floppy disk could be forensically traced back to its origin. The Wichita Police Department, working with the FBI, arranged for a response to be placed in a local newspaper. The answer published: no, a floppy disk could not be traced. It was a deliberate lie. Shortly after, a floppy disk arrived in the mail addressed to a local television station. Forensic analysts from the FBI examined the disk's metadata. The last document saved on it had been modified by a user account named Dennis. The document had been created on a computer registered to Christ Lutheran Church in Park City, Kansas. Dennis Rader was president of the Congregation Council at Christ Lutheran Church. He was arrested during a traffic stop on February 25, 2005. He offered no resistance. He later told investigators he had genuinely believed he could not be caught. He had been corresponding with law enforcement, on and off, for more than 30 years. Forensic behavioral researchers have identified several overlapping motivations that explain these return patterns across different offenders, and the consistency of those motivations across cases is significant. The first is what analysts call fantasy reinforcement. For many violent repeat offenders, the crime is preceded by months or years of internal fantasy, a detailed psychological narrative that builds before any action is taken. After a crime occurs, returning to the scene or victim allows the offender to access that memory in a specific, sensory way. The location becomes a retrieval trigger. This is documented in the FBI's research going back to the Wrestler Douglas era. Many incarcerated offenders describe the post-crime return as a continuation of the experience, not a separate behavior. The second motivation is dominance and control. Criminologist and psychopathy researcher Dr. Robert Hare, whose work forms a foundational layer of forensic psychology, has documented how maintaining a sense of power and control is a core feature of psychopathic behavior. For offenders like Ridgway, returning to a victim's remains was not an act of sentiment. It was an act of possession. The body remained, in his internal framework, something over which he had total authority. Returning affirmed that authority. The third documented motivation is investigative insertion, perhaps the most operationally consequential of the three. FBI profiler John Douglas has written extensively about a category of offender who experiences the public investigation of their crimes as a continuation of the offense itself. The investigation is an audience. The media coverage is recognition. And for these offenders, staying connected to that investigation, through news monitoring, through vigil attendance, through direct contact, is, psychologically, remaining present in an act they are unable to fully complete. This is what forensic behavioral research indicates drove Rader's 30-year correspondence. His communications were not confessions seeking capture. They were, according to documented analysis of the case, a form of ongoing engagement with the crime, a way of never fully leaving it. Ted Bundy, in the years before his execution at Florida State Prison on January 24, 1989, spoke with FBI agent William Hagmaier in a series of recorded interviews about his own post-offense behavior. He described returning to remote dump sites in Washington state locations in the Cascade Mountains where he had left victims, not to disturb evidence, but to spend time at locations that held a specific psychological significance for him. He discussed these returns in clinical, detached language that agents noted was consistent with someone for whom the period following a crime was as meaningful as the crime itself. Robert Hansen, an Anchorage baker who murdered at least 17 women in rural Alaska between 1971 and 1983, provides one of the most concrete physical examples of this psychology. Hansen would fly his victims by private plane to remote wilderness areas, then hunt them. After their deaths, he returned to their burial sites. He kept a private aviation chart, a navigational map, on which he had marked the locations of his victims with handwritten notations. When a surviving victim, Cindy Paulson, escaped in 1983 and identified Hansen to Anchorage police, investigators executed a search of his home and found the map. It contained the locations of over a dozen individuals. Hansen had returned to those sites so many times that he had committed them to a document he kept hidden in his residence. He pled guilty in February 1984. He died in custody in September 2014. Forensic psychologist Dr. Ann Burgess, who worked directly with the FBI's Behavioral Science Unit and co-developed foundational criminal profiling methodology, has noted in published research that the scene return in serial cases is rarely impulsive. It is planned. It recurs, and because it is a behavioral pattern rather than a one-time lapse, it becomes, for investigators who know to watch for it, a predictable variable in an otherwise unpredictable crime. Predictable behavior in forensic investigation is an opening. The cases on this channel are built from court records, investigative files, forensic research, and documented offender statements. No speculation presented as certainty. No embellishment. Just the architecture of what actually happened and what it tells us about how violent crime is committed, investigated, and ultimately resolved. If that is the kind of inquiry you want more of, the subscribe button is there. New cases go up twice a week. The next one is already in progress. There is a question that investigators return to, not the scenes, but the question itself. Why do they come back? The research gives a consistent answer. For most of these offenders, the crime was never meant to be a singular, completed event. It was the beginning of something they intended to sustain. The return is continuation. The correspondence is continuation. The map with handwritten notations, kept in a locked cabinet in a bakery in Anchorage, that is continuation. Law enforcement learned to use that need as a lever. Forensic analysts monitor crime scenes after the fact. Detectives examine attendance at vigils and memorials. Investigators trace metadata from floppy disks sent by killers who could not stop making contact. The tools change with each decade. The behavior they are designed to detect has not changed at all. Gary Ridgway is currently serving 49 consecutive life sentences at the Washington State Penitentiary. Dennis Rader is serving 10 consecutive life sentences at El Dorado Correctional Facility in Kansas, with a minimum review date of over 175 years. Robert Hansen died in custody in 2014. Ted Bundy was executed in 1989. Each of them came back. Each of them, in a different way, made that return the instrument of their own undoing. SEOTAGS. True crime, serial killers, criminal psychology, crime scene return. Forensic investigation, cold case, BTK killer Dennis Rader, Green River killer, Ted Bundy, FBI behavioral analysis, forensic psychology, serial killer caught, unsolved mystery, murder investigation, true crime documentary description. What compels a serial killer to go back to the scene, to the victim, to the investigation itself? In this episode, we examine 4 documented cases where post-offense return behavior became the key to an arrest that might otherwise never have happened. From Gary Ridgway, the Green River killer, who admitted in detailed debriefings to returning to victims' remains and ultimately led detectives to dozens of unrecovered sites. To Dennis Rader, the BTK killer, whose 30-year correspondence with law enforcement ended when a floppy disk's metadata placed him at a church in Kansas. These are not cases of sloppy criminals making obvious mistakes. These are cases of a documented psychological compulsion studied by the FBI's Behavioral Science Unit for decades. We also examined Ted Bundy's own recorded admissions about returning to dump sites and the navigational map found in Robert Hansen's home, a physical record of every burial site he had returned to in the Alaskan wilderness. All facts drawn from court records, forensic research, and documented investigative files. 000, Hook 0, 15. Introduction 100, the FBI's research and the pattern 300, the Green River killings and BTK. The crime 600, how both were caught 900, the psychology. Fantasy, dominance, and insertion 1200, more cases 1300. Final thoughts, true crime, serial killers, criminal psychology, crime dossier, forensic investigation.